Asalaamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome back to the fourth episode of the Muslim Woman's Hour. We're revisiting a topic that we visited a session ago regarding othering the Muslim community and the consequences that that may have on the Muslim individual. Panelists have changed, so we have Farah and Sofia today alongside myself, Dr. Rachel Sarah Lewis, and we're going to get into this. The question is, what are the potential consequences and what do you see as othering of the Muslim community in the UK? Well, we could say in the West in general, because we could cover Europe, USA, and the UK in that question. How about it, ladies? Who wants to go first?
Farah, you go ahead, because
I think it has a vast implication for Muslims in all aspects of their lives, from education to start off with, because the prevent a directive and duty upon schools and educational institutions is so tough, and it's been further made even more say counterproductive, but even more targeted towards the Muslim community recently. So then that prevents Muslims in school and college and university from expressing their views, and if they do, then prevent gets called and then they can be criminalized. And then in terms of health, access to health, often people are discriminated against in their access to healthcare, in the treatment, and this has implications for their whole lives. There's been research done which categorically shows that Muslims who work, for example, in the NHS, there's widespread Islamophobia towards them, but also for patients, and that's something I've experienced personally. There's also discrimination as a Muslim when you're in employment. For example, being able to go to pray, being able to get a job, being visibly Muslim. A lot of Muslim women have great difficulty getting a job. If they get a job without wearing hijab and they put on a hijab, then they find that they lose their job. There's also an overrepresentation of Muslims in the criminal justice system because penalties are much harsher. There's less leeway given. For example, if someone who's say born into a Muslim family, they're not practicing, but if they commit a crime, then it's associated with their religion, it's associated with terrorism. Mental health doesn't come into it. Whereas if you're a non-Muslim, then there is leniency in terms of they look at your whether you have health problems or other problems that could have contributed to that, and that is has very, very serious implications for us throughout our lives. Going back to the education issue, I mean, there was recently a case at a school whose name I can't remember, where some students were prevented from praying, and it went all the way to through the court system, and they found in favour of the school, which was really shocking. And I actually attended a webinar given by barristers, and they were really surprised at the judgment because they so much leeway was given to the school. And I predicted from that this would become more problematic in other schools. And literally within a day, I saw a letter circulated by a different school, which was also shutting down their prayer room on some, very dubious excuse, which was not true. And so, children lost their ability to pray at school. And I'm sure this is going to spread out throughout all schools and other institutions, which is really frightening and very unwelcoming, and making us feel as a community that we should really go somewhere else. And that is something that I think Douglas Murray said, that we should make the lives of Muslims so impossible, so difficult that they want to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that also. But then if you think the school that you're talking about, the school in Northwest London, is that the one you're
That's right. The name escapes me.
Name escapes me also, but there's also a school in Leeds that has done a very similar thing. Batley and Dewsbury have experienced very similar things, and so have Birmingham, Leicester and Manchester. There are schools across the board who have now taken that as the right for them to not offer prayer facilities and are using safeguarding and freedom of expression, which is quite ironic, freedom of expression, to say that is the reason why they are not allowing students of the Islamic faith to actually pray on school premises. There's a case of a school in High Wycombe which has stopped students wearing long skirts to school. and have insisted that they all wear the same brand of trousers,
Wow.
regardless. And wearing the brand of trousers is quite, they're not, they don't leave anything to the imagination as the trousers that they've sent, that the girls are now required to wear. So you've got essentially what they're trying to do is push you out of every sort of avenue in that idea. Sophia, what do you think the implications are? Or do you have any potential implications?
Okay, so with Muslims, we sit at the intersection of racism, classism, and Islamophobia. Not all Muslims, and some Muslims more than others. And this results in a particularly hostile living within the UK. Our experience usually from, especially like obviously Muslims of color, it's always, their experience is usually quite hostile, especially if they're visibly Muslim. There's clear ostracization, but one thing that I pick up, even within my own life, is a blockage of access to resources. And this is in terms of your personal development. So access to mental health, access to medical health, but also, especially within your career, there's just a blockage, especially for Muslim women. Even if we look outside of the UK, it might not be as bad as it is in France, for example, with the hijab. You physically cannot prosper within your career. You cannot sit within the boardrooms. You can't access the buildings you need to access with your hijab. And it's very clear that there's this attempt that if we stop them from, their religion, then maybe they'll leave. It's almost that sort of, the hostility is sort of leaning in that direction, and it starts right from the beginning. So from sort of prenatal care, we already know that it's not just for Muslim women. Of course, it affects, mostly at the moment actually affects Black women worse, but even within the Muslim community, the way that the care that's given is subpar compared to what's given to white people. And also Muslims themselves, we have a unique sort of position in society where we are one-dimensional, we're only Muslim, whereas for other human beings, there's this holistic approach towards their humanity. They're viewed as different parts, and they're sort of treated as a full human being. And then when it comes to Muslim people, you're Muslim and that's it. It's very two-dimensional. You're not treated holistically. There's no considerations for the person's background. Somebody who's from let's say they are, from quite an extremist family, and their son has gone out, and now, there's another Muslim man who is from a non-practicing Muslim. There's no consideration for how practicing the family. There's no consideration for, is this person even practicing? How Muslim is this person? It's just your surname, and that's who you are. And the knock-on effect of that is we're all kind of treated with we're painted with the same brush. It's a very it's a hostility. There's a lack of empathy in it. There's a lack of humanity in it. And where it's most apparent is within the schools, because you'd think that for children there would be kiddie gloves and it would be more of a soft approach. If a child wants to pray at school, children have done much worse at school, but this child, the girl for the Michaela school, she wanted to pray at school, and she wasn't a bad student anyway. And it was actually what's left out of that story was that the kids used to pray in the playground, but adults, Islamophobic racist adults, used to abuse the children and they used to verbally abuse the children. They used to throw things over the fence of the school, which is why they then had to start praying inside. So now we accommodate Islamophobes, but we don't accommodate Muslims. We don't even accommodate Muslim children. So I found it quite interesting that the way that the narrative was twisted to demonize Muslims, when actually the problem had been caused by Islamophobes to begin with.
A lot of what you're saying is the idea, it goes back to what was being said about the notion of it being, let's make it as hostile as humanly possible so that they eventually leave. But what do you leave to go where? Because the question is, this is no longer they come from Somalia, they come from Bangladesh, they come from, I don't know, Sri Lanka. There's no real... Some of these younger children have never been to these countries where they're claiming that they need to go back to. So in that idea, the othering is double-barreled, isn't it, for them? it's a double-barreled gun, because you're not British enough, and that's where you were born, but you're also, you go back, in a sense, back home, and you're not authentically ethnic enough. So you're stuck in that essence, and then you can't get mental health support because you're unable to access mental health support where it's not understood within the community. And then also outside of the community, you're not seen as severe enough to require mental health support because nobody really understands the intersectionality that you're standing on.
And you're sort of viewed as it's self-inflicted because
Yeah.
you're Muslim.
Yeah.
And so you're not a victim. Yeah. And also you're dangerous on top of that. So you're not when you're in the position of the victim or somebody who's in need, or they're in dire need of help, and it's not always the case, but a lot of the time you're the threat. You know, you can't be a threat and a victim at the same time. And so you're this sort of perpetrator. Obviously, the demonization of Muslims within the media for decades has brought us to this point where our humanity is basically non-existent in a lot of people's minds. What holds some of it back, I'm suspecting, is probably like infrastructural and just law and regulation. But on an individual basic level, the humanity that should be afforded to Muslims usually isn't. And the demonization of Muslims it's probably the largest contributor to this. So it's really difficult to break the barrier when first I need people to see my humanity, you know?
In order for it to be treated like a human, you have to be seen as one. And if that's something I think the Muslim community and the Black community have always had in common, is the idea of not being able to be seen as a full person, and the inability then for you to access anything.
So the implications as well is of sort of the knock-on effects is, for example, for this girl at the Michaela School who's been denied the right to prayer, it breeds trauma within kids. I personally, experienced that to a certain extent, with Islamophobia, but didn't quite register. Wasn't able to articulate at that age what was going on. But then you're a bit frightened going into sixth form, going into college. You are quite aware because of your experience in high school and because of casual Islamophobia, and obviously sitting in that cross section too of racism and Islamophobia. You have your guard up, and then the knock-on effect is into adulthood. You're not very likely to integrate, and then your children are further disintegrated and further ostracized, and then the problem snowballs.
Okay.
Yeah.
But can I just come in there, because I think there's a really important point that we haven't mentioned today, and that is that there is a targeted campaign to make Muslims be conceived as terrorists and a threat. And there was an interesting interview with David Miller, who was prosecuted for anti-Semitism, and he won his case. And he said that since 1984, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, had been involved in spreading this propaganda and misinformation and demonization of Muslims to make us be perceived as a threat, as terrorists, and in order to basically prevent the Palestinians from being seen as victims of aggression by Israel. And so by creating the impression that Arabs are terrorists and all Muslims are therefore terrorists and a threat and barbaric and like a fifth column, they disseminated this information throughout the world. And I remember he was involved with Breitbart News, and they spent millions. Steve Bannon was involved in this, and they spent millions disseminating terrible things about the Muslim community through their news networks, through social media. And this has changed people's perceptions of Muslims and made people really scared to interact with Muslims, because they think we're, evil and a threat and fifth columnists. And it's really very stressful if you're a Muslim, to deal with non-Muslims when you can see from the way they react to you, from their non-verbal communication, that they are hostile towards you, and you're not sure how to react. And no matter what you say anyway, that you can tell that they've got a perceived prejudice towards you based on what they read in the media. And I know there was some research done a few years ago, and they found that for every positive article about Muslims, there were 23 times more negative
Yes.
articles. So that was at least 7-8 years ago. So I would suspect it's a lot worse now, and it's really frightening to be a visible Muslim woman, even when you're not a visible woman. Like you said, the fact that you are not white subjects you to racism,
Yeah.
and then when you have an added factor of being a visible Muslim, then it's like having a target on your back.
It is very much so. And I think for me, being a Reva, I sort of, on paper, I would automatically get the first stint of racism by picking that I am of an ethnic minority mix of some description. But then to walk up to those people in public and explain who you actually are, it's more of a sense of the understanding of shock and awe, so that you've managed to achieve so much. But then also the idea of, but why would you choose to be a Muslim? Because it's synonymous with why would you choose to terrorize British society? Rather
Absolutely.
than being, why did you make an individual faith choice? Which is what you would get if you converted to something like Christianity. It would be like, oh, that's really brave of you. But to convert to Islam is more of an idea of you have chosen to become a loaded gun. And when we talk about the idea of not being able to access healthcare and all of that sort of stuff, we're talking about and going into the idea of economic disparities and poverty also. We had yesterday's conversation was quite interesting because it was the idea that a lot of Muslims tend to, or when figures are released, figures don't really take into the idea that a lot of Muslims live in multi-generational households. So possibly don't need as much economic resources as much as a family who are living in an individual enclave of family in order to survive. But it's the idea that when they think about Muslim women and they think of usually, if we think traditionally, the man was working and the woman was at home, they would put that into the idea of economic disparities and poverty. And there seems to be this very, very big push for young Muslim children from the age of 2 to be going into nurseries. And they're pushing them into nurseries and then requiring that they stay there so that the mum is able to go to work. And that has another layer of problems for the Muslim community in general, because if you are not able to transfer that knowledge of them being a visibly or practicing Muslim from a young age, if your mum is now working 40 hours a week, where is that cultural element of the child coming from? What is necessarily going to be the problem? And do you see economics and poverty as a problem that stems from the othering of the Muslim community? Or do you not?
I mean, that's for people who experience ostracization and any community that is otherized. The definition of otherization incorporates financial difficulties and poverty and sort of generational poverty. It comes with a package. Anything from because of the otherization, you're limited to certain areas unless you have the economic ability to rehouse yourself. You're going to be placed in poor, more urban areas where not only is the school within the catchment area, your kids aren't going to get very far, in those schools, but also the healthcare and the childcare that's afforded to the child. But what you mentioned about kids being shoved into nursery at younger age, it's almost as if our children in these areas are being institutionalized because their parents are not trusted to do the right thing for their own children. And so it's better if we step in, we'll take care of the child, which it's subpar child a daycare center that's not very good for any children. And we're not trusted to do the right thing. So we'll take the children. You can go on off to work, and obviously there's obviously a different conversation about whether the country is even motherhood friendly. But yeah, that's just how I view it. That's my perspective on it.
It's a loaded question, I understand. Is
I mean,
the
there was a lecture by Imam Tom Facchini talking about the impossible state, and in that he talks about this book in which it basically secularism is defined as the murder of God by the state, and the control of the state of religion. So, one could maybe consider that it's a way of by controlling children from a very young age, by putting them into state education or state systems, you are therefore separating them from their belief, especially if you prevent them from practicing their faith, and therefore they can then be supposedly assimilated, but also removed from their culture and from their Islamic faith.
And you find that a lot, don't you? It's the idea of we're going, and that's the purpose of essentially of the national curriculum, is to give them an education where everyone is the same and uniqueness doesn't necessarily stand out anymore. And if uniqueness doesn't stand out anymore, you've got the elimination of individualization. And that individualization is then going to lead you to all be quite plateau. So subdue everything about you that makes you slightly different. And then that is the difference between what we get with legislation, which is we want you to integrate, versus what we really want is assimilation.
But actually, I think it's wider than that. People think that we live in a democracy, but actually we don't. Britain is a very authoritarian state. You're only allowed to express views that are within a small spectrum of what is acceptable to the state. And if you're Muslim, then you already have, the target on you. And if you express views that the rest of the population would also espouse, for example, the issue of Palestine, then it's associated with your faith, not with your desire for humanity and for people's lives to be saved, which is very problematic.
And you find that people, even if they are not Muslim and they attend these rallies, are then realizing quickly that their support of a Muslim population, and it's a majority Muslim population, but you still have, within Palestine, you have Christians, and you also have people that identify as Jewish, but are not part of the Israeli state. And they are demonized also. But the only people that you see at the forefront of all of this is the Muslims. And because they have been so cleverly dehumanized for several decades now, it's a case of, oh, they're not really human, so does it really matter? And you hear people with the same amount of rhetoric. The rhetoric is that we're not really killing humans per se. And then that satellite idea of the UK and the US supporting what is going on in Palestine, you are then questioning the state and the way the state operates. And even if within the idea of a democracy, we cannot be a full democracy because we have the House of Lords. It's legislation by favor, isn't it? It's not necessarily legislation by democratic process, because we can only vote for so much.
Exactly, and the current political parties are basically right-wing and far-right, and that's your choice. And if you, as happened recently in the election, decide as a community, well, the mainstream community, to vote for an independent, then aspersions are cast on the way the election was carried out, and that is disgusting. What's been happening recently. I mean, I don't know whether this is something we need to discuss here, but the way that the Muslim independents who got in are now being smeared and libeled, and had false accusations made about them about how their campaigns were run, when actually there was dirty tricks on the opposite side. And I was watching not the Andrew Marr show, and also Owen Jones' podcast, when he interviewed some of the independents, and they were basically talking about terrible things that were done to them and their campaigns during the election. And yet that was not mentioned at all in the media. And now there's going to be, I don't know if it's happened already, there was going to be like an inquiry run by Yvette Cooper about, the legitimacy of these election, of those particular particular
Excellent.
elections in those areas, and their candidacy, which is appalling. And all the right-wing rhetoric in the papers trying to, claiming that, this is, we're heading for a grim future, and it's a terrifying future because these, basically underlying, Muslim independents have got in, and we're heading for, a Sharia state and all this nonsense, when, Muslims form, approximately only 6% of the population. 6%. How can Muslims take over the country? And anyway, people don't want to. Muslims don't want to take over the country. If they want to take over the country, they wouldn't have come here in the first place. The ones that people who immigrated here, and Muslims are, on the whole, very law-abiding members of society, and the society and the values espoused by Islam are very high moral values. And when people, become aware of them, they're really shocked. And I don't know if any of you have seen this, but there's a young lad called Grayson Brock in America who's been doing podcasts, and I've been following him. And the first one, he was asking, why do people say such terrible things about Muslims? I've just read the Quran and it's amazing, and it's very similar to Christianity. Why is that? And he was asking all these questions, and over quite a few months, it looks like he's now become Muslim. So that's really, very, very interesting.
And I think that's going to be another problem, isn't it? Not just in the US, but also here. It seems like a lot of prominent free-thinking young people who have been allowed to have access to things because they have, it's the idea that ignorance is no longer bliss, because ignorance at its forefront leaves you with a distorted view of what's going on around you. But for those people who could have said, well, I don't see this, or I don't know that, nearly everyone has a smartphone. So everything is documented and everything is sent to you, regardless of whether you think you know it or you don't. And that idea of that assumed ignorance is pushing back very hard on the youth that they were supposedly trying to protect from this idea of Sharia law and a level of compliance. And then also we've got to think about the idea of, if economic disparities and poverty are the consequences of othering, then overcoming that, a lot of the young boys have been forced into things like gangs, but they're not necessarily going into it just for the economic process. They're going into it because it's something that they can essentially, feel comfortable doing. They've got a new identity where they are not being othered. And that identity is then going to be a lot more toward what they feel they are as an individual.
I don't know if that's happening amongst practicing young Muslims. I think that's maybe young people who are not practicing, or maybe born in a Muslim family and are rejected by society on the basis of racism, and don't feel maybe understood by their families, or maybe feel alienated. I don't think that's true of, like I say, practicing young Muslims, because they would have identity and be part of a mosque and feel part of the community if they were on the deen.
But then having the idea of being on the deen, and what we mean by that is practicing of the faith of Islam, we do have that issue actually, and it's becoming a bit more prominent in certain areas of London and certain areas of Manchester, and particularly Leicester. It's becoming an idea that, okay, fine, I'm not taking drugs, I'm not doing anything to harm me personally. And it's the idea that they want to be able to do certain things financially, but they can't actually do them financially because they didn't grow up in a place with money.
It's one of the implications, isn't it? This was in the 2011 census, where Muslims were 46% of the Muslim population reside in 10% of the most deprived local authority districts, and that just is going to foster sort of gang violence or extremism, or because just by virtue of being in an area where there is no youth programs, the schools are run down, the area is not child friendly, it's not development friendly, it's not so these boys then essentially are groomed almost in a way into a lifestyle that probably their parents and their communities or any person wouldn't condone, and it's sort of like a flaw in identity. the Islam itself promotes a society and a community, and it's a religion of people. It's not a religion of individuals. And so to be able to raise a child and to have them, just it's saying being on deen, there's pillars in the community that you need to be able to foster a young person, to be able to support a young person who wants to be on their deen. One of them is a functioning masjid that isn't just for old men to go and pray, a functioning community center, functioning mentors that are able to support this young person. But we don't have access to those things. Why don't we have access to those things? The community itself is under attack from the greater society. And so, how are you able to really build and develop the ideal Muslim community that you would need to be able to bring, and it seems, I say young men because it does seem to affect young men a bit more, who are demonized. How are you supposed to support that sort of identity? That the sort of identity that a young Muslim is supposed to have isn't promoted within the society anyway. It's not viewed as cool already. It's already difficult to try and convince our young people to become that. But what's worse is that living in these sort of deprived areas, and even if they don't, they're sort of subject to grooming. They're groomed into gangs essentially, where you will find a sort of brotherhood, you will find companionship that you're not going to find from the greater society. But it is as a result of being in the cross section, of being ethnic minority, but also of being Muslim, definitely. Yeah.
So if we were to look at possible solutions to that, are you saying that the Muslim community needs to look inwards more and actually have a lot more of our volunteering programs? Because I think Farah, what she was trying to say was a lot of the masajid that we do have tend to be ethnically centered. And if they are ethnically centered, they tend to have an imam or a leadership or board membership that all seem to speak the language of back home. And that's the problem that we have, is that the imams are unable to convey the message that they need to convey to the community that's standing in front of them or sitting in front of them. I
think that's true in certain parts of the country. I don't think it's true everywhere, but I'm not saying it doesn't exist, because I'm aware that they've like Bangladeshi only masjids and Pakistani ones, and some masjids they're not so welcoming to reverts and things. I think things are getting better in London, but I don't know if that's true of the rest of the country. I also think there's an issue of insularity amongst the management. I think there's also an issue of older members of the mosque community being very unwelcoming and quite aggressive towards young Muslims. I mean, my son, has had, been shouted at, been, physically manhandled in the masjid when he's gone to pray. And most recently, a couple of weeks ago, and I've had to actually intervene and call up, the imam of one masjid to say, look, my son's got special needs. He's coming to the mosque. Why are you, why is he being treated like this? And that imam then had to speak to the old man concerned. And then after that, that old man did apologize to my son. But this is a different masjid, where this week, last week, where something happened, where again he was, and this puts young people off from going to the masjid.
But then it also puts off the idea of motherhood also for mothers, because sometimes you may have but we have to acknowledge it. The othering has taken a toll on the men in our community. And that has meant a lot of mental health issues. Some of them are then not able to be the active father that they need to be in order to raise these children that they're supposed to be raising. And we're having a lot more women joining, or a lot more women embracing Islam, and a lot more men leaving.
Are you talking about reverts leaving, or are you talking about
in general? And
born Muslims?
Born Muslims.
But isn't that to do with the impact of being in a secular society and being tempted by,
sometimes it's not necessarily a temptation. More of it's the idea of maybe it is temptation, and it's the idea of it's just easier to not be. But then if they were originally married and had children, you've left children now at an even worse situation of the idea. But then you've got mothers who would then take a child who they want to practice their deen to the masjid, and those same older uncles or those same older members of the community, your child makes a slight noise and they're ostracized. because the same thing that's happened to your son has happened to me as a mother with children in the masjid. Yeah. Oh, it's the specific term that was used was an older uncle, must have been at least in his 60s, early 70s, sort of went, "Oh, this is not a place for children." I was sort of like,
yeah, there's total ignorance amongst, I say total, but a lot of ignorance amongst that. But my son is an adult, and he wanted to be in the first line. You know, he likes to be in the first line of the prayer because he wants to get more reward. And some guy thought it was his place, so he physically moved my son while he was in the middle of doing like a voluntary prayer in the middle of it. Can you imagine?
It's the entitlement, isn't it, of the older?
Absolutely, that's what my son says. It's entitlement, that they think that just because they're older, that they think they can treat us this way. And he was asking about, about respect for elders. Are we still required to respect our elders when they're disrespecting us? And I thought that's an interesting, very interesting debate. And he said because it's going to prevent young people from going to the mosque, and then you have another generation lost.
Yeah. And we are,
and this is really serious. It seems like a minor thing, but it's even happened to me. I mean, I've stopped going to. I'm chronically disabled, but I went to mosque on Eid, and some woman manhandled me, and I'm in so much pain all over my body. And and I could see I was using mobility aids, and I said to her, "I'm in pain, don't touch me." And my daughter said the same thing, and she still just thought she could older woman, old lady, thought she had the right to just manhandle because I'd answered a call by my carer. Literally just very, I think I hardly said anything, and she took umbrage at that and did not like it, and she just decided she could just manhandle a disabled person. And so I stopped going. I thought it's so hard to get there anyway because you're really ill, and then if you go there you get treated like that, then you think, well, you know what, I'm not even gonna try.
And then that means that has a knock-on effect on your deen, and it has a knock-on effect on the community, because you have stuff to offer the community and speaking to the community that you may not necessarily hear. But then we've got an added layer of things that we did not have when we were younger, is if you lived in an area of social deprivation, you saw only social deprivation, you saw only economic deprivation. Now these young kids are given smartphones, and the moment they're given a smartphone, the world is their oyster. They have access to everything. So they are seeing the Instagram reels about how much this person has and how much that person has, and they're wondering why they don't have. Why is it that we can't afford? Why is it that I don't go on international holidays 3 times a year? And that calls into question then, okay, yes, we have the social economic disparities and the othering, but then what are we going to do as a community to make sure that doesn't happen for the next generation, or at least improve the generation that we live in?
The thing is, it's so hard. It's so hard for young people now. And I was just aware of research that was done where, someone with a Muslim name is 3 times less likely to get a job interview than someone with a non-Muslim name.
Yep.
And the same thing happens with jobs as well.
Jobs, and then the law was changed recently for car insurance, wasn't it? Because if you lived in a predominantly Muslim area and had a very ethnic sounding name, even the car insurance generators were giving you a higher quote.
Really? Oh, I missed that.
Yeah.
That is shocking.
If you had, because and I thought it was a joke at first, right? Because I was like, okay, that means whoever's programming this is actually thinking about these things and has this level of prejudice going on already.
It's endemic, and I'd say it's systemic.
It is,
and it's being encouraged by people like Michael Gove, and now obviously it's extremely concerning that Nigel Farage has got elected as an MP, because he's been saying that really very, very racist and Islamophobic things during the prior to the election, since the election, and then all the way
like that, though, isn't he? He's always been like that.
I know, but now he's got legitimacy because he's an MP.
He has.
And the thing is, what concerns me is that Reform, and they're going to get more and more candidates in, and then the country's going to lurch even more to the right. And they very clearly say that they don't want Muslims to live here anymore. And then you've got really far right, and also, I mean, Tony Blair's been saying openly that the Labour should consider the views of the country, which are moving towards the right because of the complicity of the media in generating all this this smear campaigns against Muslims and dehumanizing us. And I remember seeing somewhere where questions were being asked about, well, the way things are going, is this going to be a safe country for Muslims in the future? Is there going to be another is there going to be a Bosnia happening here? I mean, it's happening in India, it's happening in Palestine.
And that's the thing though, isn't it? But then with the economic issue and the idea of poverty, it will be a Bosnia in that idea, because if we don't raise the bar of ourselves economically, even from the idea of our deen, it says that the upper hand is better than the lower. So if you have the ability to give, you are seen as more than the person who needs to take, not necessarily in terms of deen wise, but just the idea that you will have the ability for someone to be jealous of you in that regard. So needing to do more for ourselves, I think, is the only way to go.
I think I just want to step in with the, sorry, apologies to interrupt, but even when we do step in, Mohsin Ali, the independent MPs that have come out, and they've taken the horse by the reins, as you say, and they've gone for it, and they've been voted in with the intention to make a change, leading on issues that concern the Muslim community. Palestine is one of them, but also growing, tension and Islamophobia within the country. And what's the end result of that? They get so much abuse, so much racist and Islamophobic abuse. And so even when we do take charge and we do step up and we say, okay, we're going to lead the way, and we're going to change our situation, we're going to do for ourselves, you're shut down. The media completely piles on, and you're unable to even stand up for yourself politically, which is, in a democracy, supposedly the only way that you're able to stand up for yourself. And so where do you go from there? Where when you're powerless, then you're powerless and you're open to all forms of attack. But then even when you do empower yourself and your community votes for you and you stand up, the way that, so in these recent, so I actually live in Hare Hills myself, and I saw what took place, and the way that it was exaggerated in the media is shocking compared to what had actually happened. And it stemmed from an unfortunate event where Roma, a gypsy couple, had lost their children to social services. And so the Roma community was obviously angered by that and just were hurt. And instantly Muslims were blamed.
Oh, yes.
All across the media, not just in the UK, but in other European countries and in America. They're talking about Muslims rioting in the UK. It's a complete lie when you're able to just sort of lie like this. What meaning, what democracy is there? But just to bring it back to your point where you say, what if we do more for ourselves? The people who do more for themselves are attacked the most.
But what I'm not talking about more for themselves inside of the framework that is currently being awarded to us. I'm talking about more for ourselves outside of the framework that's being given to us, because we know that it's never going to be, and we know from religious texts that they're never going to be happy with you until you become one of them. Yeah. So it's the idea of not necessarily going down the road of getting yourself elected or getting into a seat of power, because that can corrupt someone, even with the greatest heart, very easily. What I'm saying is, if we are doing more for ourselves within the community, so not looking for outside help. If you want a youth service project, don't look for a grant for funding. You go about it in the idea of crowdfunding within the community. If you need hospital treatment and it's outside of what the NHS is willing to offer us, crowdfunding and sorting it out within the community, because there are communities within the UK, within the US, that are self-sufficient. Why can't Muslims become more self-sufficient is what I'm asking.
I think that's sort of it's a tricky one, because I wouldn't say it's victim blaming almost, but when a community is otherized and for generations, it's difficult to just sort of generate wealth that's needed to support each other. That takes a lot of first of all, education and economic prosperity that we just don't have access to. And so the blame it sort of shifts the blame a little bit when we say
shifting the blame. It's not shifting the blame. It's more of the idea of, okay, so look at, say, for instance, the Orthodox Jewish community. Yeah, there's no reliance on the state whatsoever. It's the idea
they're able to they operate within a different system of privilege.
But that's no, they don't. No, not the communities I'm talking about. They don't necessarily operate in a different community of privilege, because even if you look at the Palestinian rallies and marches that are going on, you have Orthodox rabbis that are being beaten up the same way in Israel as
No, of course.
that are being killed in the same numbers, that are
Mm.
being ostracized in the same numbers, the same way they are here in the UK. They are ostracized in the same way. But that ostracization didn't make them want to, I don't know, further integrate into the community. They actually pulled away completely to the
Right.
point where the kids are not educated in the school framework. The children are not socialized in that framework. Your healthcare is not in that framework.
Mm.
So it's the idea of being totally outside of the framework. Is that an option for us?
I think it's a good idea, but I think we can't really compare, because the Jewish community, especially the Orthodox Jewish community that you're mentioning, they're not ostracized and dehumanized in the way that our community is, because we're considered to be a threat all the time. And if, for example, your child doesn't go to school, I remember a few years ago there was some new law brought in about trying to monitor and make homeschooling to be registered and to be checked on by the state, because there were concerns about what Muslims are supposedly teaching their children, and that they might become radicalized or become extremists. And as a homeschooler yourself, I'm sure maybe perhaps you can tell us about that yourself.
It was a potential register. They're looking to do it again because it came up in the King's speech.
Wow.
They're looking for the idea of being able to have a now local register. But it's the idea of registering any child that is not within mainstream school, which brings into catchment quite a lot of people, but the target is Muslims and Jews.
Exactly, but mainly Muslims, because I don't think Jews are perceived as a threat. It's Muslims that are perceived as a threat, and a fifth column.
The Jews that I'm talking about, the ones that attend things like yeshiva, they are also deemed as a threat, because they're a threat to the homogeny of the society. And I think that's where it's coming from. It's the idea that because they stand outside of the normal framework, we don't know what they're doing. So what are they doing that is a threat to us? Rather than facing all of the issues that they have within society as it is, so failing schools, benefit cheats, tax avoidance, they're not willing to deal with any of that. We're not going to deal with the idea that you could say to a home ed family, you're not providing a viable education for your child, and send them to their local school, and that school be a failing school. That's not necessarily seen as much of a problem. But it's the idea of, are you affecting the homogeny of the society? And if you are affecting the homogeny of the society, then you are deemed as a threat. And I think Muslims are always going to be deemed as a threat. Anyone that's different is deemed as a threat.
But I think one of the main things that needs to change actually is the way the racism legislation is drafted, because at the moment you've got protection under the law if you're a Hindu or a Jew, or is it Sikhs? And so Sikhs and Jews are protected under the law. However, if you're Muslim, you're not. You have to prove intent, that somebody intended to discriminate against you. That's practically impossible, and that was done by Tony Blair. So if you're if for example you're a white Muslim and you get discriminated against on the basis of your faith, you've got no protection under the law, because you can't resort to racist legislation, and you have to prove intent. So I think that needs to change. And also, there's the reason why Islamophobia is not taken seriously is because there's been a huge campaign by, for example, the Henry Jackson Society, the policy. What's it called? Policy. I can't remember the name of it, but to basically make it seem like the term Islamophobia is a big problem. And I remember there was an article in the Jewish News in which two so-called Muslim MPs were made to basically criticize the adoption of the all-party parliamentary committee definition of Islamophobia. So they got Khalid Mahmood, who recently lost his seat, and who was, had become so arrogant that he was actually shouting at his constituents in a meeting, and he was filmed doing that. And then also Sajid Javid, MP, basically wrote an article for the Jewish News in which, they wrote an article basically slamming the Islamophobia definition and saying it was, opening the back door to all sorts of dangers, which is appalling, because you betrayed your own community, and it means you're so out of touch with what's actually happening and the experience of, you know, especially Muslim women at the coalface, where we're getting physically assaulted, attacked, hijabs taken off, beaten up, all sorts. I mean, you mentioned in your podcast yesterday about the things you've suffered personally. It's really horrific and it's really frightening, you know. And what kind of life is it where you feel scared to even leave your home?
And that's the problem, is the uncomfortability of it. It's microaggressions, it's consistent microaggressions. And those microaggressions then formulate themselves into something greater, don't they?
But many of them are not. I mean, there was some footage circulating, I think, last year of this. God, it was terrifying. This woman in a hijab. This guy she was standing at a bus shelter, and some guy crossed her and hit her on the head with a large slab of concrete.
Yeah.
And then there was another case where this woman was standing on a I think she was at the top of the stairs going in I think London Underground station, and some guy came and literally shoved her down the stairs, and she fell and she banged her head, and it was really terrifying.
I think what makes it particularly insidious is that it's not just within the UK, and it's sort of across most of the West, and even in India, as you say, etc. But the Geneva Convention actually came out, and even sort of in the UN, they noticed that the rising levels of Islamophobia is at alarming levels at the moment. It's sort of it's been going gradually for the last, well, since 9/11 really, and this sort of phony war on terrorism, but it's everywhere. So where do you escape it? It's not just a British ignorant thing. It's you can't cross. You can't really cross over to France and then it's fine. It's all across the world, which makes it almost as if we're sort of drowning within it. And so when you say, just to take it back, Rachel, to does the solution lie within us? I'm not so sure. Because it's something that's Islamophobia is at all levels of the Muslim community. It's not something that we can escape through economic prosperity. It's not something that we can escape by moving country. So,
but then if it's going down the line of a new Bosnia, what other options do you have? Because if you're being ostracized politically, you're being ostracized economically, you're being ostracized in the healthcare system, you're being ostracized in education, is it not then incumbent upon us to then decide that, do you know what, enough is enough? Going into the system is not working, so trying to change it from within we can see is not working. Maybe the system that was never built for us in the first place.
Well,
that's the whole thing. It's a system, no matter how you look at it. The way the system was built was never built with us in mind, because if it was built with us in mind, you wouldn't need all the amendments.
Yeah.
But just going back to what, just going back, I just looked it up because I think it's important for people if they want to look it up. So the report I'm talking about is by Policy Exchange, and Policy Exchange were basically the main think tank for the Conservative Party, and a lot of policy of that government came through Policy Exchange, and we don't know who funds them. I mean, there've been claims that they were funded by APAC and other such Zionist organizations, but I wouldn't disbelieve that, because most of the stuff that comes out from it is very Islamophobic. And this article that I was mentioning was actually in the Jewish Chronicle, and it talks about these MPs were claiming, these so-called Muslim MPs, was that accepting this Islamophobia definition, which was put forward in that 2019, and this is why Islamophobia is not taken seriously, because there are people constantly criticizing it, trying to make out that it's something else. And so what they're claiming is that that it would damage counter-terror efforts and risk creating a blasphemy law via the back door, which is complete nonsense. We're not looking for blasphemy law in this country. We want protection from physical attacks on us, from discrimination in all aspects of our lives, as I mentioned earlier, education, employment, the police. I mean, all our interactions with the state and private, and the private aspect of of our lives.
Well, I think with some of these think tanks, etc., they have a real issue with the word Islamophobia, and sometimes I just venture to listen in on some of these quote unquote Islamophobic podcasts, but they have a real problem with the word because it protects Muslim people, and Muslim people are not supposed to be protected. And actually the way that they respond to this word is they say, well, phobia is sort of an irrational fear, whereas it's irrational to fear Islam. And so Islamophobia as a notion doesn't make any sense, because the basically they're arguing that the standard is to demonize Muslims, and that Islamophobia, really, to be Islamophobic is to be normal, and it's normalizing basically discrimination against Muslims, essentially. So it's evil, really, and it's just completely unacceptable. But a lot of it isn't just sort of coming from public conversation, and it's just from society. It's funded. It's a lot of these talking points are coming from these think tanks that are funded by God knows who, as you say, and there's sort of this narrative is pushed into the public psyche. It's not organic. It's not a conclusion that people have come to, because there is no basis for it. There's no basis for reason to fear Islam. If you sort of read the Quran, and anybody who understands the religion understands that it has no basis in reality. It is essentially Islamophobia. But just to add on that, there is an intention to get rid of that word, and they really don't like that word because it is the last sort of frontier, and it makes Islamophobia unacceptable. The word itself, the fact that it has a name, what's happening to us is named, they don't like that.
And what they're using, which is really disgraceful, is that they're using so-called Muslim MPs or Muslims to help them destroy this. So, for example, Khalid Mahmood, former MP, wrote for Policy Exchange, and he said that the term Islamophobia has already been used to suppress debate.
He is actually now a senior fellow. He's now a senior fellow for Policy Exchange.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, he is now a senior fellow. So it's the idea of you can always find them, right? And it seems like it's a terminology that we use within our communities, especially the ethnic minority communities. It's this idea of tokenism.
Yes, absolutely. And we can't use the word. I would have used the word coconut, but you're not allowed to use that.
You're not allowed to. Yeah, my brother used to. So it's the idea of that. It's that tokenism of, we've got a Muslim here, and if he or she is not objecting to it, why do you have a problem? And how do you respond to that when you've got another Muslim, clearly someone who identifies as Muslim, but maybe very liberally or very loosely due to being Muslim by name, but not practicing anything? How do you necessarily then lessen the evil of that? Because that's
and also I remember Sajid Javed being quoted in one of the Nationals a few years ago saying that the only religion practiced in my household is Christianity.
Yes.
And yet they've used him to write forward to that Policy Exchange report, in which he wrote, I remain concerned about the significant risk that counter-terrorism powers and policies will be undermined on the basis that they are Islamophobic.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's the idea of if the fear of Islam is irrational, right, then it deems the rationality of the community. What is the rationality of the country? But in order to have that, you have to have had some sort of quote unquote British identity. And even indigenous British people can't agree on what British identity is. If you even look at the idea of what we've come to know as the common British values that they are now teaching in schools that the Conservatives pushed, that has respect for others and their differences, but that difference is not awarded to Muslims.
Absolutely. And like I said, there's a concerted campaign to prevent that. And also they're trying to make it look like it's a criticism of Islam rather than the racism, religious hatred, and the consequences of that. The manifestation of that religious hatred against us. So I just think it's important to just read this a bit more, if that's okay. So basically, Sajid Javid is quoted saying, "As a former Home Secretary, I know the government duty to protect its citizens is of supreme importance. Anything that puts that at risk must not be allowed to happen." He added, "No religion should be immune from criticism, yet this definition would risk creating a blasphemy law via the back door by targeting legitimate speech. Critics are right to question how such a definition would be consistent with freedom of expression and also the potentially dangerous consequences of suppressing it." Well, the Islamophobia, as we know, the Islamophobia, we're not talking about criticism of the religion. We're talking about basically discrimination against Muslims, religious hatred towards us, and how, and a way of protecting ourselves from this, from physical assault, from attacks, from abuse, in the way that the Jewish community is protected by anti-Semitism laws.
because we're a newer community? Or is it because we have an intersectionality of so many different communities that require representation under the banner of Islam? Could that be a part of the problem?
We're not a newer community. Muslims have been
But we're
UK
seen
older
as a
than
newer
what we're led
community.
to. We're not seen as that, and it's sometimes that narrative is driven that Islam is, you know, sort of a pretty new thing within the UK, but Islam is as old as even just sort of this country has a relationship with Muslims and Islam dating back centuries. Muslims are not new. The Muslims themselves are not a new community group within the UK, but that narrative is encouraged that this is a new force that's invading. But it's
new and alien.
Yeah, we're being alienated more than we've always been Muslim, but we're alienated in a different way now that would have people believe, or the way that our community is perceived is that it's a new invading, they're all coming over, they're all doing, you know, but Muslims have been embedded within British society for centuries.
But then
they've even been reverts to Islam amongst the aristocracy. I remember, you know, there was a lord or something in the 17th century who wrote about, you know, becoming, you know, a Muslim. So it's not new, like you say. It's I think a lot of this is linked with Israel-Palestine, because by driving this narrative of Muslims being terrorists and a threat and all that, it justifies the actions of Israel against the Palestinians.
I mean, you saw that it's sort of during these riots, well, there weren't even riots, but a few days ago, what had gone down is the Zionist media, which Zionist funded media, they've jumped on that straight away, and they said we cannot have the Israel-Palestine conflict be something that is, sorry, I forget the name of the man who says this, but we can't leave it as something that's sort of happening abroad. We need to link it back to Muslim communities in the UK and to show them this is how violent they are, and this is the same exact version of Islam that we're dealing with, you know, quote unquote, in Israel-Palestine. And so it's an opportunity for them to jump on that to justify their own apartheid. So you're absolutely right, and I see that pattern. When I engage with the media, I can see it.
But then
and also another thing is that the definition of Islamophobia has also been linked to extremism by Sajid Javid in that article, which is really, really concerning. And so they can just be dismissed as, oh, it's extremists who are saying this. It's not really, it doesn't really exist. And you know, all the things. Anyway, I'll let you speak.
But no. But even having been a teacher in schools, I see this within the school framework. It's the idea of you've got two children fighting, and one's a Muslim child and one's a non-Muslim child. The Muslim child gets a lot more sanctions. Also, it's also the same as for Black and brown children of any sort of persuasion. They get a higher level of punishment than the child who originally started it. And it was the idea that we had one particular teacher who said something along the lines of, she was Asian teacher, supposedly she was a Muslim member of staff. That's how she was pitched to me when I started. But when I started teaching them, she sort of took an instant disliking to me on the basis that I was visibly Muslim. So hijab, abaya, that made me a threat to what she had deemed as the identity of what a Muslim should be. And being my direct superior at the time, she was sort of, well, we have a policy. And I was sort of like, we? Who's we? If a child calls another child the P word or the N word, you've got to ask the child what preceded that. Sort of, pardon? So no matter what happens, the child has to prove that they were antagonized enough to retaliate. So someone has got you on the floor, kicking you and shouting racist slurs at you, but you have to prove that you didn't do anything before that, but you're still then sanctioned for being engaged in physical violence in the first place, but you are the one being picked on.
It's vile.
That is absolutely disgusting. But it's totally unacceptable. It is totally acceptable.
Policy. That is the underlying policy, that we have to prove our innocence to prove their guilt. You have to prove how innocent you are in order to be deemed a victim. You could be the one with bruises, but you have to prove your victimhood.
Is that just if you're Muslim, or is it just generally?
It was a Muslim thing at first, because there was a young girl who had her hijab ripped off in school, and the senior leadership did nothing. I said something about it, and the lady, who was not visibly Muslim, not practicing, but she had been the only Muslim member of staff in the school for many years, when I brought it up as though that seems like an Islamophobic attack because what was said alongside it, not just because her hijab was ripped off, but because something else was said alongside it, which was openly Islamophobic. She said to me, there's no Islamophobia in this school.
This is the problem as well, is that when our children are victimized and subjected to religious hatred and like to use the word Islamophobia now, because I think perhaps that's the wrong term that was picked, but I think basically I'll call it anti-Muslim hatred. We have no recourse to justice, and we get disbelieved. And where does that leave us? It leaves people, like you say earlier, traumatized and possibly developing mental health problems.
And then you can't find treatment for it.
You know, that term that you used, Farah, when you said anti-Muslim hatred, that is actually these people who want to sort of do away with the term Islamophobia. They want to use anti-Muslim bigotry in replacement of that. So I think it's really important that we continue to use Islamophobia, because it's not separate. Islamophobia doesn't mean irrational fear of Islam. It means hostility towards Muslims. That's what it meant before. But I think it's really powerful because it has Islam within it, just to say that. But that what you witnessed at that school, Rachel, is it basically it just shows the level of institutionalized Islamophobia that you have within schools, that it's actually normalized to the extent where violence against children is now pretty much authorized.
I will have
if they deserve it.
I will have
this
to
is not a new thing.
videos.
This is not a new thing. I remember at least 20 years ago, maybe more than that, 25 years ago, there was a young girl of Bangladeshi origin who was, or Pakistani origin, in a school in Newcastle, where she was being bullied by a teacher for wearing a hijab. And at the time, and I actually went into the school and tried to do an interview with that teacher, and she got really scared and she was hostile to me as well. But things changed after that, because she was trying to blame that she was like maybe young teenager, and trying to basically blame that girl for the discrimination she was suffering from other students and from that teacher herself. It was really, really an eye-opener, and just totally, totally evil, basically.
But then even if we look at things like the case of Shamima Begum, for instance, it's the idea that I think our children are made to seem or made to identify as adults a lot earlier than their counterparts. They are seen as adults automatically the moment they are taller than certain people. They're not given the benefit of the doubt of being children. So they must have the intent of doing something to antagonize someone who is so young or so naive or so innocent in general, that they're going to depict our children as making adult decisions when they are not cognitively available or have the ability to do that.
But that's a deliberate ploy to blame, to victim blame. I remember, it just comes to my mind, I remember during this genocide against the Palestinians, there was the reporting of, there was a 2-year-old or 3-year-old girl was reported in the media as being a young lady. Yes. And yet an adult Israeli soldier was described as a girl.
Yes.
And that just summed it all up. That how can you call a 2-year-old or 3-year-old a young lady?
It's the idea that we're not ever given the idea of being innocent.
Well, language is intentional. It's not just that it's accidental. It's very intentional.
Yeah. Not accidental at all.
Calculated words and language is policed within the media to portray a certain image and so that it riles up sympathy for certain people and hatred towards others. So it's very
Muslims just die and others are killed,
Yes. Because you could see it even within the difference in reporting between the Russia-Ukraine issue and the Palestinian-Israeli issue. It's, Russian soldiers killed X, Y, and Z. were attacked, Russian soldiers attacked and killed, and then gave numbers. But when it came to reporting of the Palestinian issue, is that, oh, certain people have died within a school. So they just magically died, is the way that it's formed. But the idea that if we look at this in another way, and we look at the idea of gender inequality within the idea of how Muslims are othered, we did allude to it earlier that Muslim women seem to get a bad rap at this because if you are a practicing Muslim woman, you are more likely to be a hijab wearing woman. What does that do to the othering of the Muslim woman and the trauma that they will then hold and how does that then affect any children or community that they then need to go ahead and raise?
I think there's a serious impact, because if you can't access employment, if you get discriminated against in employment, or if you get discriminated when you try to access healthcare, children see it. It affects you before you get married and have children, and it affects you even more when you have children, because then you have what's called systems generated trauma. There was actually a conference which people can look up, organised by Leeds University a couple of weeks, I think it was the 9th of July, which I attended online, and in conjunction with Cerebra, and they were talking about how, this is more to do with special needs, but, parents of children with special needs, when they interact with the system, they get traumatized because of the way they are treated by the system. So, for example, if parents of disabled children want to get help and social care, what mostly happens is that they're subjected to a child protection investigation, and children are removed. And I think they said it was an increase of 159% of child protection issues raised in the past 2-3 years.
Yeah,
shocking statistics. And also, if you seek help in the NHS, often questions of fabricated or induced illness are raised, and I'm aware personally of people this has happened to.
Yeah.
Because, and particularly happened to Muslims, where they've gone to basically have their child investigated to see if there's some problem, and then they've been told that the child's case is functional, and then when they've gone out, they've seen the same thing being told to another brown family. And when they happen to say something to that particular consultant, because they're waiting to ask a question, that consultant froze because they realized, oh my God, this person overheard what I said.
Yeah.
And it turned out that child didn't have functional, which is basically all in the mind. It turned out they actually had a serious medical condition. And I wondered how widespread this is in the NHS, where families are being told, oh, it's functional. And when a child's being described as having functional neurological disorder or functional, they are prevented from getting any other treatment or any other investigations, which is really, really concerning. Because
they've had the initial investigation, and then the mum or the parents that are involved are usually mum, actually, in most cases, regardless of whatever religion or intersectionality you're talking about. It's the idea that the mum herself is then deemed to have Munchausen by proxy.
Yes, but what I'm saying is, that's one thing, but also but also because of the prejudice and the racism, the anti-Muslim, the Islamophobia of the medical professional, the child then the child's denied proper investigation and proper treatment, which is really frightening, and it's setting up problems for the future.
It is, but then it's also setting up problems for the future, and it could be seen as rather cynical. But when that person then goes out into the big wide world and has the ability to engage with other members of society, and they do something which is deemed incorrect, it sort of deems the idea of within education you have this school to prison pipeline, but then within the medical professional it's the same thing. It's misdiagnosis to prison pipeline.
And also there's another aspect there, like you said, in terms of gender. If you're a woman, you're not taken seriously, you're disbelieved. So that, like someone mentioned earlier, there's classism, there's sexism, there's the Islamophobia, and then situations like yours, if you're black, then you have even more more prejudice on top of that. So it's really, really tough, and I think it's very important for for institutions and for for state bodies to recognize this and actually do something, as well as us as a community trying to help ourselves, because like you say, it's been going on for decades, and we should, I think, look to try and help ourselves now, because I've been back in the system for decades, and it's very hard to get anywhere. So I think that is something that we need to explore, but I don't know how possible it is compared to the Jewish community, because we don't have the wealth that, you know, that is abundant in the Jewish community.
And that is a problem.
We don't. And also with Muslim women, another thing I pick up is that we're viewed as sort of antagonistic, and where we don't have bodily autonomy, we don't have the democratic right to be able to determine our own fate, our own spiritual fates. It's not viewed as an individual choice why we wear the hijab, however we choose to wear it, or if we choose to wear it. It's viewed as you're antagonizing the nation, and it's a direct affront to British values. And so when you then present yourself to these institutions, whether it's the hospitals or schools or just even within employment, and I've experienced it myself, it's almost sort of like, how dare you, you know, you come in here with that, and you're starting off on the wrong foot, and you're already you're here to be antagonistic. You're viewed as an antagonizer. Why are you choosing to wear that? Why don't you look like everyone else? You're not afforded the same privilege as maybe like a Jewish person is wearing a yarmulke, or a Sikh is wearing a turban, or other people who choose to dress in however funky ways they choose to dress. That's not afforded to Muslim people. And so when you're now, and my nephew's autistic, and my sister wears hijab, and so when she's interacting with medical professionals, there's a certain level of fear of how she's viewed, and she has to really go out of her way to make sure that she knows what she's talking about, so there's no room for error, because you're just not afforded the same empathy
But
as a
then you're
Muslim
still
woman.
seen as antagonistic for knowing too much.
Well, yeah, there's always
How dare you? How dare you have pulled articles? How dare you have been aware of what's going on? How dare you know that there's a new treatment option for your child? And how dare you want to go and do things outside of the system and how it's done? Because my son is on the autistic spectrum and chosen not to go down the route of diagnosis, and the reason for that being is, you know, that the help, you're going to be dealing with an upward battle anyway, so if it's an upward battle that I can avoid, I'm just going to avoid it. It doesn't hinder, I did it in a way that it's not going to hinder him later on, but it's going to be one of those ways where I don't have to fight for the right of my child. But then sometimes I do question that if I fought this fight, or if I do go ahead and fight this fight, am I fighting this on behalf of other Muslim women who necessarily don't have the resources that I have and can't necessarily go ahead and pay for private things that I can pay for? So do I have that need for the whole community being on my shoulders and needing to say, okay, maybe I do go ahead and go down the route of helping someone else go for diagnosis because they require it? So it's a problem with Muslim women, is the idea that we've got this idea to take care of everybody. Then we need to take care of our own also. So it's the community. Do we take care of the community and our family, or do we just take care of our families?
That's community, isn't it? There's a certain level of responsibility that is on the shoulders of people who can do more. They have to be, if you have the resources and the education to be able to communicate that to medical professionals, you are sort of paving the way for other mothers who don't have that access.
And then the problem then that we haven't added on to that is we do have new communities that are coming forward, and they are, like, say, for instance, the Somali community, for instance. And then there is some Somali women where it is going to be a language barrier. The new Sudanese community, going to be a language barrier when speaking to medical professionals, even things like Language Line, the translation service. How some of them are not medical professionals themselves. How do you convey the idea of autism in Arabic if you've never come across that terminology before yourself? So the mum who's sitting, she's at a loss because she doesn't understand what's going on with her child, and she's, in a way, feels that it's her fault that there's something going on with her child.
I remember a very recent case. A friend was asking me for advice. Literally happened within a few weeks ago, where there's a Somali sister who has quite a few children, and she does speak English, but it's limited. And she was told that the child was in the wrong school, and severely needed to be in a special school. And asked my friend to go along and support her. And when the local authority found out that she was going to be present, they contacted my friend, a Muslim sister, and told her, "Oh, there's no need for you to come. It's just a greet and meet meeting." It wasn't. They basically ambushed this poor Somali sister, and they got her to sign all sorts of documents and got her to agree that the HCP that they'd done several years before and hadn't updated it against the law, or produced a new document. And the upshot was that the poor child didn't get what it needed. And my friend found out afterwards. And I think it's absolutely disgusting the way advantage is taken of our Muslim sisters, and especially those who have, like you say, language barriers or who are not familiar with the system. And that's why I promote, the need for us as a community to be literate in terms of, legally literate in terms of special needs, and especially in terms of our rights. Because if we aren't, then we get taken advantage of on a huge scale, because they rely on the fact that we don't know.
Yes, and that's when what I was saying about ignorance not being bliss is because to be ignorant as a Muslim, and you're already at a disadvantage. If you are ignorant about the way the law is presented to you, that's even more of a problem.
And there was a really horrific situation, I think last week. I don't know if you saw it. There was a video going around where this elderly Muslim lady in hijab had attended some protest in Swiss Cottage in London, and had left it and got followed by some police officers. Fortunately, some protesters who were there saw this was happening and followed the police and filmed it, and they stayed with the sister, and basically the police were accusing her of making pro-Hamas signs. I don't know what pro-Hamas sign is, and trying to arrest her and saying and so these people who were filming it were saying, well, on what basis are you arresting her? And they're saying public order offence. They're saying what section, what law, what blah blah blah, and then the police wouldn't say, and this poor woman was really scared. You could see, and she just wanted to go home, elderly woman. And then they said, no, you have to tell her under which, and then they threatened the other people with arrest.
Yeah.
And so there's all this intimidation going on of our community, which I think is intentional to shut us down.
It is, because it's to shut you down and then shut you out.
Yes.
Because it's the idea that if they don't know, what's stopping us from doing what we want to do to harm them?
But yeah, it's a
really
level of
scary.
comfort when it comes to harming Muslims. Yeah, they're quite comfortable doing so because they are under the sort of, they think that we're not going to know any better. We don't know our rights. We don't know the law. And so when there's a certain level of comfortability that they have engaged with Muslim community that they might not have with other communities who they deem as more economically empowered or educated, when the police know that there will be consequences, that they wouldn't act as swiftly. So, but not only do they think that we don't know how to protect ourselves, they're also encouraged to attack us more because of the institutionalized Islamophobia that they have. So it's like a double whammy almost for Muslims.
Yes, because then there was the other case, I think in Bethnal Green, was it last week or the week before, where this Muslim man was standing outside his car and he had a Palestinian flag, and suddenly a police officer turned up and started hitting him around the head. It was all filmed.
Yeah.
And then other police officers came and they shoved him to the ground, and then the first police officer carried on punching him on the head. Yes. And then they arrested him for assaulting the police officer. And then the community got together, I think 100 of them, and they went and protested outside the police station in Whitechapel, I think that evening, and demanded that he be released. And then eventually he was released without charge. But it was shocking to see that footage.
I think then coming out of this, I think a lot of us need to, ones of us that have individual, so if we go for completely our solution-based, that I think a lot of us that have the idea that we know certain things need to do more. And it may just be like a half an hour of your time every, like 14 days, where you sit down and you have your own version of what you would call an MP surgery, held either in your mosque or a local coffee shop or whatever. Somebody makes an appointment to see you and you can help them fill out forms, speak to them about the concerns that they're having about their children in school, speak to them with concerns about what they're having with the LEA, if they've got autism issues or prognosis that they need help with, but things that they don't necessarily understand. I think if a group of us in every particular city or every community need to come together and have those of us that are professionals, or those of us that have the knowledge, even if you're not carrying a title, you have the knowledge to sit down and to be able to say to, especially sisters, because if sisters know the situation, they are more likely to act than husbands. Let's just put it out there and be real. Because at the most of it, you're the one responsible for the community. The brothers may sit at the head of the mosque, but we're not fighting that fight right now. That's not the fight we're fighting. The fight we're fighting is for our next generation. And our next generation needs us to be able to voice what their concerns are and help them to tackle certain things. If you are really just great at algebra, for instance, look at the masjid and go to the masjid. You know what? I want to run an algebra class for several weeks at a time to help our kids pass GCSEs. If you know a lot about nursing, run a first aid course. If you know something about, I don't know, prevention of burns at home, to help a sister, go to a sister's house and help her set up her house so it looks slightly differently. If you know that someone doesn't speak a particular language and someone's reported them to social services, for instance, go and sit with them. Even if you're not going to be there to do anything else apart from emotionally support them, sit with them and provide emotional support.
I think in sitting with people like that, this lady I met at the masjid, unfortunately, she has terminal cancer, and so she's in a lot of pain, but she's not being given adequate pain medication. And I wouldn't have known that if I didn't sort of sit with her. But it's just hearing how they're treated. And sometimes when you can speak English and you can communicate, you're treated differently sometimes to somebody who's even worse off and who can't communicate what their needs at all. And she was basically shut down and just treated like she was sort of abusing medication. This is a Muslim woman, middle-aged, with children, and she's terminally ill. And in addition, she wasn't given other social care needs that terminally ill patients normally would receive. So I've made a few phone calls here and there because even if I can't help, there's other people that it's about connecting people.
Signposting.
You know, but the first step is to sit with people. And one thing I do see in the Muslim community, there's a real roll the ladder up behind you mentality when people make it out, which we've just kind of fought to have because we're all on the same boat, and it's just sinking from one end before the other. You know, we're all going down with it. So.
But it's even the idea of like Muslims who have businesses, for instance, if you run an accountancy firm, what stops you giving a child who wants to become an accountant in the future a job for the summer? What stops you doing that? Nothing.
I think that's excellent. I think that's excellent ideas, Rachel. I really do. And I think there is a lot that we can do for ourselves as a community in that way.
And as Sophia was saying, is we need to stop rolling up the ladder behind us. Like people have said to me, oh, okay, well, my child wants to go to university and I don't know how to get them there. I've been to university. So if you want to speak to us about an avenue of how to get into university, let's go for it. Let's sit down and have a conversation. Let's talk to the other parents about how you get your child into university. Let's see what the criteria is. Let's show each other the way of making this work for us until we've got an alternative solution. Because at this moment,
I'm aware that, and I've seen, posts by various sisters who, are running like sessions to help people get into dentistry school, to get into medical school. I think that's really good. And others are offering free teaching. My son is offering free coding, for people who want to learn,
See, and then it's all of those sorts of things that we just need to get together. And I think as a community, we could do something similarly. Like Farah, I need to steal your son at some point, because I need to look into something where it's not necessarily, we all have a smartphone. So why is it so hard for us to connect with each other? I may need to like physically come to Newcastle and sit down with him, or to wherever you are. Actually, no, you're not anywhere near there, are you? You're near me. I'm not even sure where you are, Farah. That doesn't help the situation at this present moment. But I will come wherever he is because I need to sit down with him. I need him to help me with something. And seeing as I know you, that gives me an avenue to find him, which what I want to do is something to benefit the entirety of the community, not just one arm of the community. And being at that idea, it gives a lot of our children, even if we say to them, okay, between you finish GCSEs, you want to go into A-levels, you want to go into an apprenticeship or whatever, I've got work experience for you. I want you to pound the pavement and I want you to go around to Muslim businesses and I want you to take down names and addresses. It gives them something to do during summer so they're not tormenting their parents and flounging around on the sofa and playing too many video games, or spending too much time watching hijab tutorials. I never knew styling with hijab was a thing until I had teenage girls. I never knew it was a thing.
So right, yeah.
I was like, yeah, you put it on and you make sure it doesn't look bulky, and that's all we can do. But now there's a whole styling idea. Even getting those sorts of things where you talk to the girls, or girls retreats or boys retreats, they need to stop being so community individualizedly focused and start connecting our kids from up and down the country with each other, so that when we're gone, we're going to go at some point, they've got a way of helping that legacy of Islam move on, whether we stay in the UK or we don't. And as a community, I think we need to think about solutions. We know what the problems are. We are highlighting all of the problems, but we need people to step up and take that viable solution process. Half an hour a week is not going to kill you. You spend more than half an hour a week scrolling through YouTube or Instagram. Let's leave a legacy. Let's leave a mark.
Who's going to organize this? This is the thing, because a lot of people are not motivated, or they don't think of it.
But then the whole thing is we have a lot of people that are willing to think about it, but we don't have people who are able to mobilize people. And mobilizing people, I don't know, I like doing it. It's kind of a thing.
I think we can do it even as individual people. I mean, just even if you're not affiliated with any particular organizations, you are probably aware of young people, elderly people, sick people, mothers who within your own community who you suspect are in need of some sort of support.
Even things
reaching
like
out to them.
having a baby, or for the sister that's terminally ill, they may eat food from their own culture. If she's unable to provide that food for her family, there must be someone else in the community who can help.
And there is normally, because Muslims are the most charitable, and there usually is somebody who's who's willing to do that. But it's just about connection. But it's getting out the house ourselves and sitting with people.
I agree. I think there's. I mean, I'm aware in my locality that when when there's someone sick and they had a baby, then someone will set up a like a WhatsApp group and say, well, people can take turns to provide food for that person. I think that's really good. And then there's some other organisations just been set up voluntarily to try and help people with social care, for free. But I don't think it's been very successful because people are not going and providing that for people, unfortunately. And there's a big issue with social care, lack of social care, in terms of being able to get it through local authorities, because since Brexit, a lot of people have left the country, so people are being left without care.
Yeah.
And it's really, really dire situation.
And a lot of people are you've got the idea of being left without care. People that are working in care are underappreciated, so they're not willing to go above and beyond like they would have before. And time is restricted with whichever person you are indeed with. So you're ending up with a lot of social isolation for a lot of the elderly, for a lot of those that are infirm, a lot of those mums who don't necessarily have access to their local childcare centre or their local baby group because it's been shut down.
And the disabled and those with learning disabilities,
exactly,
who also need social care, and they're left out the whole loop. So then, because when social care is considered by the people in general, they just think of it as elderly, but actually there's people with special needs, learning disability, disabled people who also need social care, and they're not getting it. And this is a particular problem in the Muslim community because of barriers in terms of as we've discussed, Islamophobia, not being aware,
culture and language.
Yeah, and so people are just not getting it. So people are left without being able to get food for themselves, left being able to go to the toilet. Really, really basic severe situations. Yeah.
I mean, I think we, to some extent, also need to be weaned off from relying on the government, government also that is actually unreliable, because a lot of the support that used to be available for people is no longer, like, for example, Sure Start for parents, and just these are pillars of the community that we would depend upon for support, but we now have to rely on one another.
Groups. So mother baby groups, support groups for parents who have children with learning difficulties, a place for people with learning difficulties to actually go to. And the whole thing is we've got this idea that I look at the masajid and I look at it, and I'll be honest, if I say it to everyone, if I had integrated with Muslims before I embraced Islam, I wouldn't have. Yeah. And it's because I look at it from a very proactive point of view. You've got a building, yeah, building masajid. You have a community. The community needs X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. You have a building. Provide X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. It's not that hard.
I absolutely agree. And in the time of the Prophet, the mosque was a community centre, and that's what it should need to be now, especially if you've got the facilities. Open it out to the community and allow women to be involved, because in my experience in the past,
we've had
the male committees and the brothers would not let women have a say and would not let them get involved and would try to control what we do, and it's very frustrating. And active sisters then end up not being involved anymore. I remember one sister actually left Islam. She was a Viva, and she was such an active sister. It was so sad. And she was married to an imam, and I feel so sad to this day about what happened with her.
And to some extent, also, because I didn't grow up within the mosques, and the mosques are for old men, as we all know. But when I did start to be more engaged, and I am heavily, I attend the masjids, and not just one of them, a couple of them. But you kind of have to be a bit choosy, and there are some portions of the Muslim community that is oriented more around culture, and you kind of have to stray away from that and just sort of deal with Muslims who are about their Islam. And when you find a masjid like that, more often than not, they usually are really willing. And I don't know, Rachel, if you found the same, for example, like with Al Rahma, etc., where they're quite willing to engage with people, and they're quite flexible, and they can accommodate women. And so we also have to be a bit choosy sometimes with mosques, etc. But when you find one that a lot of time they will accommodate to sort of community efforts, but we do have to be a bit choosy, because I think sometimes people are a bit naive and they think, well, every mosque is just a mosque. But you kind of, if you're a bit choosy, it helps.
Society have to do a lot more. And I think as a community centre, we need to stop thinking of them as a place for prayer and just that's it.
Yeah.
Because the other
community has to think bigger.
Because the other problem is that a lot older brothers in the masjid keep telling people, oh, you can't talk in the masjid, you're not allowed to do trade in the masjid, but you are allowed to talk in the masjid. And again, this is something that I know people have come across, and it's just incorrect. It's misinformation, and so then people then feel, oh, I can only go to the masjid just to pray, and that's it. Yeah. But actually, it needs to serve a wider purpose.
It does need to serve. The masajid, honestly, now most masajids have been reduced to old men who want to pray and read Quran all day because they're retired and they've got nothing else to do. They were not there when they had viable employment, but now they think they own the place. And madrasa. So the kids, the only thing that they associate with the masjid is madrasa. We go, we pray, we leave. We go there for Eid Salah, we leave. There's no like, oh, we're going to have a youth group, or there's going to be a social circle, or there's going to be a whatever. There's none of that. There is not much of that. And even if you find an odd unicorn of a masjid, it doesn't need to be the unicorn masjids. It needs to be all masjids.
Yes. Yeah.
It needs to be all masjids, because the Muslims, if you look at the millennial population, we have more children than anybody else. Like that 30 to 40 age bracket have at least 3 or 4 children. So if you're not accommodating for those children, that's 3 or 4 Muslims you've lost.
There's a lot of short-termism, isn't there? We need to be looking to the future and
exactly.
Future generations, and there's a responsibility upon us to do that.
Because if you lose those, you're not just losing them, you're losing their subsequent children and their children's children.
Especially when there's pressure from the environment we're in to assimilate into what the common values are.
So then, is that the whole idea that the masjid needs to stop being the house of prayer only and start being a safe space for our children? It needs to start being a safe space for the community where you can walk into that building and decompress.
Definitely.
Oh,
definitely.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, ladies, thank you for your time today. We're going to wrap up now. If anyone wants to get in a question answered by you specifically, they'll run it through me and then I'll panel it through you, because I'm not giving out anyone's personal information. Some of the stuff that you've mentioned today, Farah, so the building practical solutions, idea for families, that Cerebra conference, I was actually there. So yeah, I was there. So I'm going to pop
Did you
that.
physically go? Did you physically go
Yeah,
there?
I did. I'm an alumni from Leeds.
Oh,
Leeds
wow.
alum.
It was too far from me, so I just attended online. Oh, right, okay. Yeah. Oh, wow,
It was
okay.
lovely. Melding of the minds in that place. And then I'm going to put down the policy exchange link so that people can actually see that we're not being crazy and just blaming people. But a lot of that, the people that are supposed to be on your side as a Muslim that have an element of tokenism, you've realized now that if you mention anything that they don't particularly like, you will be ostracized and outed. And we saw that during this recent election anyway. We saw that with Diane Abbott. We saw that with a lot of the Muslim MPs that were ostracized and kicked out of their parties for being too pro-Palestine. It's going down that route where freedom of speech is already very limited, but it's going to be even more limited than what we currently have. Is there any final thoughts, ladies?
I think for myself, all of this really comes back to our own individual relationships with Allah, and how we as Muslims, we don't really implement what we know from our deen within our own lives, and we're sort of living within, we're not living really as Muslim people, and the responsibility within for Muslims, we believe from the Quran that we're placed on earth as stewards, and we're people who are supposed to take responsibility within their community, and it's a religion of community. But a lot of us believe that Islam is only found on our prayer mat in our own space, and that it's personal. We've kind of adopted the sort of British belief that religion is practiced from the privacy of your home, but our Islam really is our framework. And it should be the values that we live by, and a big portion of that is community, and it is being neighborly and being active. And because we fail to do that, the ramifications of that we can see right now. So just as a sort of final nugget of, I would say, kind of go back to the basics really within our own faith to find the solutions to a lot of these problems.
Farah?
As Muslims, we are supposed to be examples to the society in which we live in. We're supposed to uphold what is right and condemn and stop what is wrong. Unfortunately, a lot of us are not doing that. I agree with the sister. We need to work on ourselves. We need to unite. Unfortunately, there's a lot of disunity. We need to come together to try and provide services for ourselves as much as we can, even if it's on a small level, on a consistent level, so that we can lift ourselves out of this terrible situation and save our future generations of Muslims from leaving the deen, so that there is some hope for the future.
Jazakallah khair, ladies. We're going to stop there. Asalaamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Alaikum salam.